On a Wednesday morning in May of 2011, Dr. Aris Thorne stood on the shuddering crown of the Nishnabotna River Levee and felt his entire 34-year-old, MIT-educated, six-figure career dissolving into the churning brown water below. 3 days earlier, this had been a textbook flood control operation. The spring melt had been biblical, a once-in-a-century event that had turned the placid river into a liquid battering ram. The Army Corps of Engineers had flown Thorne in from Vicksburg because he was the best. He was the man who had written the book, literally, a 700-page treatise on fluvial geomorphology and hydraulic soil failure, on this exact kind of crisis. His predictive models, running on a rack of supercomputers back in his lab, were the gold standard. And his models had pinpointed this exact spot on a half-mile stretch of earthen levee just south of the Route 2 bridge, as the place where hell was going to break loose. The models had been right. They called it a sand boil, a place where the immense pressure of the river, the sheer hydrostatic weight of 1 billion gallons of water, finds a weak seam deep under the levee. It forces its way through the porous substrate, traveling underground until it finds a place to erupt on the dry side, bubbling up like a spring. At first, it's just water, clear water. Then it brings a little sand with it. Then a little more. Each grain of sand it carries away is one less grain supporting the tons of earth above it. The boil becomes a conduit, an open wound that widens from the inside out. Eventually, the levee loses its foundation, slumps, and fails catastrophically. Thorne's model predicted failure in 72 hours. He'd had 71 of them. The boil, once the size of a dinner plate, was now a roiling cauldron 10 feet across, vomiting a slurry of sand and water that was already carving a new channel across the fallow soybean field behind him. His first attempt had been by the book. Modern, expensive. He'd brought in a specialized crew from Baton Rouge with a rig that injected a high-density polymer grout into the earth around the boil. The theory was sound. The 2-part liquid would mix underground and expand into a waterproof, rock-hard barrier, sealing the fissure from below. It was a $250,000 procedure. They'd pumped 8,000 gallons of the space-age chemical into the ground. For 3 hours, it seemed to work. The boil slowed, sputtered. Thorne had allowed himself a small, tight smile. Then, with a deep thud that they felt in their teeth, the ground 50 feet to the left of the original boil swelled and burst. The river had just found a new path around their $250,000 plug. The new boil was twice as vicious as the first. The second attempt was cruder, an act of brute force. Thorne ordered in a convoy of dump trucks and a D9 Caterpillar dozer. The plan was to build a ring levee, a massive earthen dam around the boil to contain it, to use sheer weight to counter the pressure. For 12 straight hours, they'd hauled and pushed and packed clay and rock, building a 15-foot-high wall in a U-shape around the geyser. The D9, a 50-ton beast of yellow steel, had its engine screaming as it shoved mountains of dirt into place. But it was like trying to dam a volcano with a shovel. The water didn't stop. It just turned the entire area inside their containment ring into a soupy, unstable bog. The ground became saturated, losing all its structural integrity. The D9, pushing one last load, broke through a soft spot. The big cat lurched, dipped its nose, and in a matter of seconds sank up to its engine block in the quicksand they had created. The operator barely scrambled out in time. The machine was a total loss, a $900,000 tombstone for modern engineering, its exhaust stack sticking out of the mud like a periscope on a sunken submarine. Now it was Wednesday morning. The levee was groaning. You could hear it, a low, constant bass note of tortured earth. Thorne's crew, exhausted and demoralized, stood in a silent knot, their bright yellow rain slickers a useless defense against the fine, cold mist that hung in the air. Thorne's phone had been ringing for an hour. The governor's office, his superiors in Vicksburg, the county sheriff. He hadn't answered it. What was there to say? His models were perfect. His methods were state-of-the-art. His equipment was the most powerful money could buy. And all of it had failed. The river was winning. In a few hours, the levee would go, and the town of Hamburg, Iowa, along with 20,000 acres of some of the richest farmland on God's green earth, would be under 12 feet of muddy water, all because of a hole in the ground he couldn't plug. Let me tell you about Silas Blackwood, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Silas was 84 years old. He was born in the same white clapboard farmhouse he now lived in, yes, a house his grandfather had built in 1881 on a slight rise overlooking the Nishnabotna floodplain. His family had farmed the same 1,200 acres of bottomland since Abraham Lincoln was president. They had survived droughts, blizzards, the Depression, the farm crisis of the 80s, and 7 major floods. Silas, at 84, was a walk-in repository of the river's moods and tantrums. He had seen it placid enough to skate on in winter, and angry enough to carry off barns in the spring. He didn't have a Ph.D. in hydrology. He had a lifetime degree in mud, water, and gravity. For 3 days, he had sat on his screened-in porch, a pair of old brass binoculars to his eyes, and watched the circus down on the levee. He'd seen the fancy chemical truck arrive and leave. He'd watched the big yellow bulldozer push its futile piles of dirt. He'd seen it sink, and he never said a word to anyone. Not to his wife, Martha, who brought him his coffee. Not to his son, Thomas, who now ran the farm. He just watched. The men down there were moving too fast. They were fighting the river, trying to punch it into submission. Silas knew you couldn't fight the river. You had to persuade it. You had to understand what it wanted and give it a different, less destructive way to get there. His grandfather had told him that. His father had shown him that. The Blackwood farm wasn't just land. It was an archive. The main barn, a massive post and beam structure built in 1902 with timber milled from their own land, didn't just hold tractors and combines. In the far back corner of the hayloft, covered in a century of dust and draped with thick canvas tarps, was his grandfather's legacy. It was a stack, nearly to the rafters, of sandbags. But they weren't the cheap, disposable polypropylene bags the Corps of Engineers used. These were different. They were made of a heavy, thick, flax-based canvas, the kind used for military tents and water buckets before World War I. There were nearly 1,000 of them, each one hand-stitched by his grandmother and great-aunts during the Great Flood of 1903. The canvas had a unique property that modern materials lacked. When it got wet, the fibers didn't just block the water, they swelled, tightening the weave until it was nearly impermeable, and they were coarse, abrasive. They didn't slide against each other. They gripped. Alongside the bags were the tools of their use, heavy iron stakes with a ring forged at the top, long-handled shovels with worn wooden grips, and coils of thick manila rope. More importantly, in a dusty roll-top desk in the farm office, was a leather-bound journal. In it, his grandfather, a man with a third-grade education and a savant's understanding of physics, had sketched the method. It wasn't just a wall of sandbags, it was a structure, an engineered system of interlocking triangles and pressure relief channels he had designed after watching how beaver dams worked. He called it the Weaver's Knot. The family had used it to save their section of the levee in 1903, 1927, and again in 1947. The Army Corps of Engineers, with their newfangled earth-moving equipment, had rebuilt the main levee in the 1950s, making it higher and wider. They'd told his father the old ways were obsolete. The bags hadn't been touched since Harry Truman was in the White House. On that Wednesday morning, after watching the caterpillars sink, Silas lowered his binoculars. He walked into the kitchen and told Martha to put on a big pot of coffee and make sandwiches. Then he walked out to the machine shed, found his son, Thomas, and his two grandsons, both strapping young men in their 20s. "Get the old bee running," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Hitch up the long flatbed. We're going down to the loft." There was no argument. There was no question. When Silas Blackwood used that tone, it meant the time for watching was over. The time for working had begun. Let me tell you about what happened when he arrived. The sound of the John Deere Model B was unmistakable. It wasn't the roar of a modern diesel. It was a rhythmic, chuffing pop, pop, pop that echoed across the flat land. Aris Thorne and his crew turned as one to see the source of the sound. Coming down the muddy access road was a tractor that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was small, green and yellow, its narrow front wheels set close together. Behind it was a long, flatbed trailer, and on the trailer sat 4 men in a pile of what looked like dirty brown rags. Silas was at the wheel, his face a road map of wrinkles under a worn-out seed corn cap. He didn't slow down, but drove right past the assembled engineers and parked the tractor 100 yards from the boil, where the ground was still firm. Thorne walked over, his boots sinking into the mud. He was exhausted, angry, and on the verge of admitting defeat. He looked at the old man, at the ancient tractor, at the pile of moldy-looking bags, and he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had reached the very end of his rope, a laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "Sir," he said, trying to keep the condescension out of his voice, "I appreciate you coming out. I really do. The community spirit is admirable, but we're a little past Sandbags here." One of his junior engineers, a kid fresh out of college, snickered. Silas killed the tractor's engine, and the sudden silence was jarring. He swung a leg over and slid off the iron seat, landing with the quiet grace of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He was shorter than Thorne, but he seemed to take up more space. He looked not at Thorne, but past him, at the angry boil. "You're fighting it head on," Silas said, his voice calm, not accusing. "You're trying to plug the hole. That's not the problem. The problem is the pressure. You plug one hole, the pressure just builds and blows another. You saw that." He gestured with his chin toward the spot where the chemical injection had failed. "We're aware of the dynamics, sir," Thorne said, his patience fraying. "My models have calculated the hydrostatic pressure at over 2,000 pounds per square foot. Those bags," he said the word like it was a foreign object in his mouth, "will be torn to shreds before you even get them in place." "That's because you're thinking of them as a plug," Silas said, turning his pale blue eyes on Thorne for the first time. "They're not a plug. They're a filter, a brake. You don't want to stop the water. Not right away. You want to slow it down. You make the water fight itself." He picked up one of the bags from the trailer. It was heavy, made of that thick, oily-feeling canvas. Your plastic sheets and your chemical gunk, they're too smooth. Water's lazy. It'll slide right around 'em. This stuff," he rubbed the coarse fabric between his thumb and forefinger, "this stuff bites. It swells. And the way we stack 'em, it creates a labyrinth. The water has to work to get through. It loses energy. The pressure drops. As it slows, the sand it's carrying settles out. It plugs its own hole. You're not fighting the river. You're letting the river fix itself." Thorne stared at the old man. It was the most ridiculous, unscientific thing he had ever heard. It flew in the face of every equation he knew, every computer model he had ever built. Letting the river fix itself? It was homespun, back-of-the-napkin nonsense. "Sir, with all due respect, you're describing a principle that doesn't exist in any hydrology textbook." "Might not be in your book, son," Silas said quietly, "but it's been in my family's book for 100 years, and it works." His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Thorne was about to order the old man and his antique collection off the site when the county emergency manager, a weary man named Dave Jensen, put a hand on his arm. "Aris," Jensen said, his voice low, "the governor just called. He's drafting the evacuation order for Hamburg. We've got maybe 3 hours before that levee is projected to go. We've tried your way. It didn't work. What in the hell have we got to lose?" Thorne looked from Jensen's desperate face to Silas's calm one. He looked at the boil, which seemed to be pulsing with a new and malevolent energy. He looked at the sunken caterpillar. Every instinct, every bit of his training and education screamed that this was a waste of precious time. But Jensen was right. They had nothing left to lose. He let out a long, slow breath that turned white in the damp air. "Fine," he snapped, the word sharp and brittle. "Fine. It's your county. But when those bags blow out, don't say I didn't warn you. We'll be pulling back to the highway to manage the evacuation." He turned and stalked away, leaving Silas, his family, and a pile of old canvas bags alone with the monster. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours, because they're the reason this story is still being told. Silas Blackwood didn't rush. He and his son and grandsons worked with a quiet, unhurried efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. The first thing they did was not to touch a single sandbag. Instead, Silas walked the perimeter of the boil, his old boots squelching in the mud, poking and prodding the ground with the handle of a shovel. He was reading the earth, feeling for the soft spots, for the places where the ground had the most give. Aris Thorne watched from a distance, arms crossed over his chest, a look of grim, vindicated certainty on his face. He was waiting for the final failure, for the moment he could say, "I told you so." After 10 minutes of silent inspection, Silas pointed to 3 spots, forming a wide triangle with the boil at its center. His son, Thomas, took a sledgehammer and began driving the heavy iron stakes into the ground at those spots. They went in deep. 4 feet of solid steel pounded into the mud until only the forged ring at the top was visible. The 2 grandsons, meanwhile, began filling the bags. They didn't fill them to bursting like the National Guard did. They filled them only 2/3 full, leaving enough slack for the bags to lie flat and mold themselves to the ground and to each other. Each bag, when filled, weighed a solid 70 pounds. Then the construction began. It was nothing like the simple, straight wall Thorne had expected. Silas directed his family to lay the first course of bags not around the boil, but radiating away from it, like the spokes of a wheel. Then they laid a second course, bridging the gaps between the first, creating a wide, flat base that looked more like a cobblestone street than a dam. It was slow, back-breaking work. Each bag was carried from the trailer, placed precisely, and tamped down with the back of a shovel. Silas oversaw every placement, sometimes nudging a bag an inch to the left or right with the toe of his boot. There was no shouting, only quiet murmurs of, "Here, a little more, that's good." Thorne's junior engineer came up beside him. "What are they doing?" he whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. "That's not going to hold anything. There's no height to it." "They're wasting time," Thorne said flatly. "It's a folk remedy, a prayer." After an hour, the wide, flat base was complete. It was a circle nearly 40 feet in diameter. Only then did they begin to build upwards. But again, it was not a simple wall. They built in a triangular pattern, laying each bag to overlap the two beneath it, like bricks in a wall. And they tapered it inwards as they went up, creating a structure that looked less like a wall and more like a low, wide pyramid with a hollow center. The boil was still churning inside the open core of their structure. They weren't trying to stop it, just to contain it. This was the part that baffled Thorne. They had left a chimney, a 5-foot wide opening, directly over the most violent part of the boil. The muddy water was still gushing upwards, unimpeded. "He's built a drain," the junior engineer said, confused. "He's channeling it." "He doesn't know what he's doing," Thorne muttered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. There was a logic to what he was seeing, a purposefulness that unnerved him. The Blackwood men worked like stonemasons, their movements economical and sure. The old canvas bags, getting soaked by the spray from the boil, were already changing color, darkening from a dusty tan to a deep olive brown. They seemed to be settling, compacting under their own weight, the coarse weave of the fabric interlocking. For 2.5 hours they worked. The pile of bags on the trailer dwindled. The structure grew, a strange earthen pyramid rising from the mud. It was now about 5 feet high, a solid, sloping ring of tightly packed bags. The sun was burning through the morning mist, and the 4 men were sweating, their shirts soaked, their faces and arms smeared with mud. Silas, at 84, worked alongside his grandsons, lifting and placing the heavy bags without a sign of fatigue. Finally, Silas straightened up. He walked to the trailer and retrieved the coils of manila rope. He and his son looped the ropes through the iron stakes they had driven into the ground earlier, then crisscrossed them over the top of the pyramid, cinching the entire structure together, pulling it tight. The pyramid audibly groaned as the tension was applied, settling another few inches into the mud. The final structure was a masterpiece of low-tech engineering, a flexible, interlocking mass held in place by its own weight and geometry. And then they stopped. Thomas and his sons climbed back onto the trailer, exhausted. Silas stood alone, looking at their handiwork. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. The boil in the center of the pyramid continued to gush, a muddy fountain of failure. Thorne looked at his watch. The levee groaned again, a louder, more insistent sound this time. A new crack appeared in the earth 20 feet from where he was standing. It was over. He took a half-step forward, ready to order the final retreat. But then he saw it, the water coming out of the boil. It had been a murky brown. Now it was thicker. It was sludge. He looked closer. The flow seemed weaker, less violent. The pulsing rhythm of the boil was slowing down. The water level inside the chimney was rising. The water wasn't shooting up and out anymore. It was welling up, filling the space the Blackwoods had left for it. The junior engineer grabbed his arm. "Dr. Thorne, look." The water inside the chimney was now just a few inches from the top of the bags. The flow from the boil had slowed to a lazy gurgle. The pyramid of sandbags was doing exactly what Silas had said it would. It wasn't plugging the hole. It was creating back pressure. The weight of the rising column of water in the chimney was pushing back down, equalizing the immense pressure from the river. The water, forced to slow down inside the labyrinth of bags, was dropping its sediment. The river was, just as the old man had predicted, plugging its own hole. With a final, soft burp, a large bubble of air rose to the surface of the water in the chimney. The gurgling stopped. The water became still. A profound silence fell over the levee, a silence broken only by the distant pop-pop-pop of Silas starting his John Deere. The boil was dead. The leak was sealed. The levee, which had been shuddering for 12 hours, was quiet. Aris Thorne went pale. His arms, which had been crossed in defiance, dropped to his sides. He stared at the strange, mud-colored pyramid and the still pool of water at its center. He looked over at Silas Blackwood, who was now calmly gathering his shovels, not even looking back at his triumph. Every computer model, every textbook, every piece of expensive equipment had failed, and an old farmer with a pile of 100-year-old sandbags and a memory had just saved them all. For the first time in his professional life, Aris Thorne had absolutely no idea what to say. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end on the levee. The next morning, Aris Thorne drove his government-issue sedan down the long gravel lane to the Blackwood farm. He found Silas in a workshop behind the barn, carefully cleaning the mud from each of his grandfather's shovels with an oily rag before hanging them back on their designated pegs. For the sandbags were already rinsed and stacked neatly in the corner of the barn, drying in the breeze. Thorne stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the old man work. There was no gloating in Silas's posture, no "I told you so" in the air. Just the quiet satisfaction of a job done and tools put away properly. "Mr. Blackwood," Thorne began, his voice hesitant. Silas didn't turn around. "Silas," he corrected him gently. "Finished up with that shovel now. You can call me Silas." "Silas," Thorne said, stepping into the workshop. I wanted to understand." He felt foolish, like a student asking a professor a basic question. "How did you know? Everything I've ever learned said that what you did was impossible. It shouldn't have worked." Silas finished wiping down the last shovel and hung it on its hook. He finally turned to face the young engineer. "You boys have a lot of book learning," he said, not unkindly. "Your computers can tell you what the river's gonna do, but they can't tell you what the river's thinking. Your problem is you see the river as the enemy, something to be conquered, fought, defeated." He picked up one of the still damp canvas bags. "My granddad, he saw the river as a powerful neighbor, mostly a good neighbor, but sometimes it gets in a mood. You can't beat it when it's in a mood. You have to work with it, you give it a job to do. That boil wanted to move sand, so we gave it a place to put it, a place where the sand would do some good." He explained the principle again, patiently, this time sketching it out with a piece of chalk on the dusty concrete floor. He drew the pyramid, the chimney, how the way the water slowed and the sediment dropped. He called it dynamic equilibrium. Aris Thorne, the man with a doctorate from MIT, stood mesmerized by a chalk drawing made by a farmer with an 8th-grade education. "Some problems don't need more power," Silas finished, wiping the chalk from his hands. "They need better thinking. Your machines are built to apply force. My granddad's bags are built to apply patience." Thorne had a government checkbook in his coat. The Corps had authorized an emergency payment of $50,000 for services rendered. He pulled it out. "The Army Corps of Engineers and the state of Iowa would like to compensate you for your time and your materials." Silas looked at the checkbook and then back at Thorne's face. He gave a small, slow shake of his head. "That levee protects my land, too. The land my son farms. On the land my grandsons will farm. Neighbor doesn't charge neighbor for keeping the water out of both their houses." He paused. "But," he said, a faint twinkle in his eye, "the church roof is leaking. If the government's got money it's determined to spend, the good people at the First Lutheran could surely find a use for it." Aris Thorne went back to his office and did two things. He authorized a $100,000 grant to the Hamburg First Lutheran Church for community infrastructure repair. Then he sat down and began to write a new chapter for his book. He called it The Blackwood Principle: Indigenous Solutions and Dynamic Equilibrium in Modern Hydrology. It made him a pariah among some of his more theoretical colleagues, but it made him a legend among the field engineers, and the ones who had to deal with mud and water and not just numbers on a screen. He spent the rest of his career traveling to crisis zones, not just with laptops but with an open mind, always seeking out the local knowledge, the folk remedies that held generations of wisdom. Let me tell you one last thing, because the river always comes back. In March of 2019, it happened again. A bomb cyclone hit the Midwest, and the Nishnabotna River, gorged with rain and melted snow, swelled over its banks once more. This time, the levee breach was catastrophic, a massive failure upriver that no one could have stopped. But downstream, near the Route 2 bridge, another sand boil appeared, almost in the exact same spot as the one in 2011. The man in charge for the Corps this time was a sharp young engineer, barely 30, with a fleet of drones and a new kind of injectable hydrogel that was supposed to be 10 times more effective than the old polymers. Aris Thorne, now a gray-haired senior administrator working out of a regional office in Omaha, saw the report come across his desk. He saw the location of the boil. He saw the new engineer's proposed solution. He saw it failing, the reports growing more frantic with each passing hour. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't used in years. A young man's voice answered. "Blackwood Farms." "This is Aris Thorne," he said. "I don't know if you remember me. I worked with your grandfather Silas back in 11. There was a pause on the line. "I remember," said the voice, who Thorne now recognized as one of the grandsons he'd seen on the levee. "I was there. Grandpa passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Thorne said, and he truly was. "Listen, you've probably heard we have a situation down at the bridge. Same spot as before." "We've been watching," the grandson said. "The engineer on site, he's a good man, but he's from the book," Thorne said. "And his book doesn't have the right chapter in it. I was wondering, are your great-grandfather's sandbags still in the barn?" There was another pause, and Thorne could hear the smile in the young man's voice. "They're on the trailer, sir. Been on there since we saw the river start to rise. We were just waiting for someone to ask." An hour later, the scene repeated itself, a ghost of an event 8 years past. The new Corps engineer, his face tight with stress, watched in disbelief as an old John Deere, a newer model this time, but still green and yellow, pulled a flatbed trailer down the access road. He watched Silas Blackwood's grandson, A man who looked just like his grandfather had, calmly direct the placement of the old, stained canvas bags into the same pyramid shape, the same weaver's knot, while the drones hovered uselessly overhead. The experts in their clean offices will tell you those bags are obsolete, that the science has moved on. They have charts and graphs and computer models that prove there are better, faster, more efficient ways. But the bags are still there, in the back of the Blackwood barn, waiting. Because some knowledge doesn't get old or outdated, some things don't become obsolete. They just wait patiently for everyone else to forget what happens when a river starts to think for